Okay, let's get started today. Don't forget that a week from today is the first exam, so make sure to be preparing for that. Don't forget the study guide available on Blackboard. I hope to have the PowerPoints posted either later today or tomorrow morning, so you can go back and review those. The lectures are also available since we're recording them, so if you want to go back and review any of the lectures, let me know and I can give you the link to those. Don't forget as well that the first primary source essay is due tomorrow if you are planning on completing that, so make sure to keep that in mind.
What time is it due tomorrow?
End of the day.
Okay.
So, yeah, and remember that it's online, so you can either submit it through Blackboard or send it to me as an email. Since Blackboard sometimes doesn't work. So we move now into the 3rd century, and so we'll finish off with the 3rd century today and Tuesday, and then the first exam next week covers the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, as well as the backgrounds. In many respects, the 3rd century was different than the previous century in that more and more became clear to outsiders that there was definitely something distinct about Christianity. It had already been developing even in the 2nd century, but as we noted, the 2nd century had moments where peace was more often the case than others. Many of the emperors of the 2nd century followed the policy of Trajan, where you didn't really look out for Christians, but if people were accused, then you had to deal with it. And so the last decades of the 2nd century had been peaceful as people followed that policy. But as we begin to move into the 3rd century, things started to change in Rome that brought more persecution and sometimes to a much greater extent. And as we noted in both the 1st century and the 2nd century, any of the persecution that Christians experienced was not widespread. It was localized in specific cities or regions. But as we begin the 3rd century and we see in the 4th century, Christianity is something being persecuted across the empire. And there are a couple of things that are going on that are related to that. First of all, is that Rome is undergoing some changes or experiencing some things in that 3rd century that are different than before. There's almost constant throughout the 3rd century, constant struggles either inside the emperor or between the empire and outsiders, so threats of invasions, of military engagement, tensions between classes and between individuals and the Senate and the emperor. And so there was a lot of fear and suspicion throughout the decades of Rome through this 3rd century. And often people were turning to religion at these times, either back to the gods or perhaps even new gods. And a lot of people became interested in various times throughout the 3rd century in what are, for them, Eastern religions. Now, today when we say Eastern religions, we're talking about Buddhism, Hinduism. But the Eastern religions at that time would be the mystery religions from Persia or Egypt. But then also Christianity and Judaism. The Romans were interested in looking to these religions from afar, that perhaps if they would provide hope, would assuage the fears, would help address some of the challenges. Additionally, while people were turning to religion, they also turned to various occult means, using magic to try and control faith, to overcome the demonic, which must certainly have been at work, given all the troubles that were going on. People trying to, through magic and through other things, try to escape death, avoid illness. And so people turned to prophets, they turned to horoscopes, they turned to the spirits, all in these attempts to try and lessen their fears, try to control their destiny, right? Try to erase some of these suspicions. And that wasn't just tied to the common people or maybe even the upper classes. Sometimes it was even at the top in the emperor himself. For Septimus Severus, one of the first emperors in the 3rd century, religion and politics were very, very closely tied together. Failure in religion would lead to trouble in politics. And so, in order to have political unity, Severus believed you had to have religious unity as well. And so particularly, he began to emphasize the sun god, Sol Invictus in Latin, the unconquered sun. Now, it wasn't that Severus was monotheistic, but it was that people, the Romans, needed to worship the sun god above any other tolerated deity. And so as long as the deities were recognized, that was fine if people were willing to hold the sun god as the highest among them. Now, there apparently were some Christians from some of the records at the time that gave in a little to this view, this syncretism. But in general, most Christians would not accept this. And Christianity, of course, the God of Christianity, was not necessarily one of those tolerated religions. Judaism, of course, had been a licensed religion, and so it was recognized. And with the Jews having certain exceptions and respect in certain ways, the Jews weren't subject to this. But Christianity being a different thing than Judaism, however, Christians were open to trouble. But Severus also had problems with Jews, and so he outlawed conversion, both to Christianity as well as Judaism. Now, the persecution that came from Severus wasn't quite empire-wide, but it was more spread than it had been in previous years. Predominantly, Severus focused on persecuting teachers and new converts. Now, if you're an emperor and you're going to focus on persecution, why would you focus on new converts and teachers as the ones that you would really pay attention to them?
I guess, one, the teachers, those are the ones that are spreading cancer, if you wish, put it that way. And then the new converts are probably the easier ones to respond to.
Yeah, so the ease of how, or the theoretical ease of getting rid of the new convert, right? You know, they aren't established in the faith, and so if you just persecute them a little bit, they'll probably give up, or they won't have that sustainable faith after persecution for a while, right? You might have to torture them for a while, but eventually they would get it. And the teachers, of course, as the promoters of this option would have been also, well, you cut it off with the source of new individuals, and you cut it off with the teachers. And so Christians were subject to beheading, crucifixion, to being fed to wild beasts, in addition to other types of punishment. While we don't know much about everybody that experienced persecution or even death, there are a few individuals that we have records of that died under this persecution. And two prominent women that are remembered from this time are Perpetua and Felicitas. Now, it's possible that these two women were Montanists, which is a heretical form of Christianity, and not really necessarily orthodox. We'll talk about Montanism. If you've been keeping up with the reading, then Ferguson talks about Montanism, so you may have encountered it there. But we'll talk more about it on Tuesday. So they're not possibly necessarily orthodox, but they were identified as Christians. They were among a group of 5 catechumens, right? People learning about Christianity. So they hadn't been baptized at this point. but they were accused of being Christians, and so they were arrested. Perpetua was well off, so upper class, had children. Little known about the husband. It does not appear the husband was a Christian or had been caught up with this. Felicitas, on the other hand, was a slave, and when she is arrested is pregnant and will give birth to a baby at 8 months. Her child will then be adopted by other Christians. There are 3 men with them, Revocatus, Saturninus, and Secundulus, that are also kind of caught up in this arrest. Perpetua's father, shortly before her death, comes to her, encourages her to apostatize, but she refuses and remains faithful. They are taken to the arena. The 3 men are led out. They are killed. The 2 ladies are attacked by a bull, but then killed by the sword. In all of this, though, of course, they remain faithful to their conviction. After the death of Severus, it would be kind of hit or miss with persecution. Depending on the emperor, depending on the region, most of the time it would be relatively limited. The Emperor Caracalla, for example, engaged in brief persecution in Africa. Other emperors would have policies like Severus, but did not push them as much as Severus had. A later emperor named Alexander Severus, his mother had studied Christianity, had received Origen, a prominent teacher that we'll talk about in a little bit, with great honors. Right? So other times there was a welcome place for Christianity. In fact, Alexander Severus had the golden rule inscribed on his palace, and evidently wanted to elevate Jesus to the rank of the other Roman gods, but didn't. Maximin, who was Alexander's successor, on the other hand, was concerned about the number of Christians in the imperial household. And so in these periods of peace, people become Christian in the emperor's household even. And so he engaged in repression, exile, sometimes torture of Christians. Another emperor after him, Philip, may have been born into a Christian home. Some early Christian writings refer to him as the first Christian emperor, but he does not appear to have lived a Christian life, simply possibly from a Christian home. But he was very, very ruthless when it came to a lot of his policies. He does, on the other hand, allow Christians to be Christians. Right? So he gives them some freedom to worship Christians, but morally, he's certainly not acting in Christian ways all the time. And so, between Severus in the early 200s and the middle of the century, there were various moments of peace and persecution to a limited extent. And largely, between the two, between Severus and the middle of the 3rd century, there was relative peace for Christians compared to what it experienced under Severus and what would happen with the rule of Decius. Decius became emperor in 249 when he had overthrown the Emperor Philip. There has been some suggestion that Decius, who was in the legions, leads a rebellion due to Philip's policies towards Christians. And so that pagans, especially in the military, have become upset at how Christians are given freedoms under Philip. And so that's where Decius is coming from. In many respects, though, Decius in general is not a cruel individual. Right? It's not like he's cruel about everything. But he is focused on this issue of Rome's glory. Right? The history of Rome. Rome is now 1,000 years old. And there are challenges that Rome is facing. And so one of the things that Decius believes is that Rome has declined because the Romans have turned away from the gods. And so he puts forward and encourages people to return to the old worship of the gods. Those who refuse to worship the gods, however, are guilty of high treason. But unlike previous emperors, and unlike other types of persecution, Decius' goal is not to kill Christians. Instead, he wants apostates, people that have fallen away from Christianity, not martyrs. Why would you want apostates instead of just killing the Christians?
I say because the Christians held the martyrs in high regards.
Okay, so the holding, the martyrs are very well respected. You give up your faith, that's a completely different issue. And so that aspect of recognizing the martyr has the ability to catalyze an even greater adherence to Christianity, whereas the apostate has the opportunity to demoralize those that are already Christians, yet also convince others to not be Christians. And so that was the goal Decius had. Right? Instead of killing people and maybe even making this worse for him, he would sentence people to long terms in prison, torture them, tempt them with a variety of temptations. He would seize the children of Christians to be raised as pagans, all in the attempt to convince people to renounce their faith. Sometimes it even encouraged mob violence against Christians, as pagans interested in enforcing Decius' decrees. As part of all of this, Decius makes a law that everyone in the empire is required to sacrifice to the gods. Not just the Christians, everyone. And as part of that, he requires that individuals receive a libellus. And a libellus was a certificate, the plural libelli, a certificate that indicated that someone had offered a sacrifice to the gods. 46 of these have been found preserved. Certainly there were much more, but a little storehouse near Oxyrhynchus in Egypt was found with these papyri libelli. And they very much read the same way. Here's just an example of what is on a libellus. To those superintending the sacrifices of the village of Theodelphia, from Aurelia Bellius, daughter of Cateres, and her daughter Catinus. So these are the two individuals who are sacrificing. We have sacrificed to the gods all along, and now in your presences, according to the orders, I poured a libation and sacrificed and tasted of the sacred offerings, and I request you to subscribe this for us. Right? So this indication that this individuals had performed those sacrifices. And then the officials signed, we, Aurelius Serenus and Aurelius Hermas, saw you sacrificing, signed by me, Hermas. The date, year 1 of the Emperor Caesar Gaius Mencius Quintus Tarsianus, Decius Pius Felix Augustus, 2027. Would have been about June 27th of 249. And so most of the libelli look very similar. And this is essentially, you have the statement, the confession that I've offered the sacrifices, and then a signature from some sort of official that indicates that they have done this. The punishment for sacrificing could be banishment, for not sacrificing, could be banishment, confiscation of property, or perhaps even death. Local authorities, it seems, were given some leeway as to which punishment they would enforce. About a year of this goes by, and Decius begins to back down. The edict is still enforced, but he doesn't really encourage its enforcement as he does in the first year of his rule. Perhaps he decided that there were worse enemies that he needed to pay attention to. There's some threats on the northern borders he needs to be aware of. But for whatever reason, he does make a change and isn't as active about that. But for a year, it is a very intense time.